Welcome to Gifted Underachievers, the podcast for mid-level creatives with delusional ambitions. In this segment, Pat and James explore the question of who, as a creative, can you disappoint? For example, when do you need to prioritize your creative work over, say, a spouse or a child? When do you need to prioritize the spouse or child over your creative work? We cover topics such as the caregiver's paradox, prioritizing creativity, self-sacrifice, setting creative boundaries, and the impact of our creative work on romantic and other relationships. Thank you.
Hey, James.
Yes, Pat?
We are here in the Gifted Underachievers Clubhouse mulling over the question of...
Wait, Pat, let me turn the vacuum off real quick. I was cleaning up in here. There was quite a mess left by your party last night. So.
Oh, yes. Sorry. You must be disappointed in me.
No. It looks like you all had a great time.
Okay. So when you're done vacuuming, you're done?
The Dyson is off.
Okay, Dyson's off. We were gonna talk about the idea that when you are trying to do something with your creative work, you're trying to get to like a finished product or something, you're trying to complete a big project. And many of us also are self-employed or make our livings out of our creative work. There's gonna be the question every so often, who can you disappoint?
Right.
Especially if you you don't have somebody managing your day to day. So you're doing that, you're doing family stuff, you're doing, friendships and extracurricular things, and you're trying to do this thing that really takes quite a lot of time. That's
Right.
what I'm seeing.
Right. And so when we think about it from a capacity
Mm.
perspective, right? And I think there's a finance and capacity perspective to this, depending on kind of how you frame it,
Good
maybe.
point.
Right. So, how do you find the capacity when you've got a full life? Uh,
Yeah.
and there's lots going on.
Yeah.
And do you sacrifice somebody in that full life,
Yeah.
their needs,
Mm-hmm.
so that you can finish this, and or you have to spend money that could otherwise go to, say, helping a kid with their student loan, or
Mm.
some other important person in your life, but you instead, decide, no, this money needs to go to finishing this project.
Yeah.
And so there's standards, I think, for both. And maybe that's part of this conversation too, is, how do you say this trade-off is worth, the finishing the project has this trade-off.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to disappoint somebody in one of these capacity or finance or both related ways.
Yeah.
So how do I know what I'm doing is the right thing to do? Um, and worth potentially, I don't want to say causing harm, because I don't think we would ever really cause somebody harm,
Mm-hmm.
but maybe not living up to a friendship in the way that we would want to, or some other relationship, or even with a client,
Yeah.
perhaps.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
maybe we could think, ourselves as well, right? So what are you willing to sacrifice to get that project done?
Yeah. I
I,
love it. I think you've explained that incredibly well. The meat of the situation is that resources aren't endless. Capacity for time, work, attention aren't endless. And the only thing I could say that I would add to that is if we round out the question by saying, I'm going to propose that if you're not disappointing somebody else, the biggest risk, okay, two things. One is, one of you could make decisions based on, your values. Say, oh, I really value
Mhm.
um, my kids' financial future, so I'm going to not spend the money I would have spent on that project. So you could look at it from a values perspective. What do I value? But I value a lot of stuff. I value most things
Mhm.
in my life. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in my life. So, um, the other thing I want to add is that there's this other person in the mix, and it's yourself. If you are trying not to disappoint anybody else, you're probably going to disappoint yourself.
Mm.
And who do you have a responsibility to in this one life you've been given? You have a
Mhm.
responsibility to yourself. People will come and go. Hopefully not your kids, but it's I think it behooves us to remember that we too sort of value ourselves, and we have we can show ourselves how much we think of ourselves by what we do and what we spend our time on. And if we don't value our own creative time and energy, then why would anybody else,
Right.
They won't. If you give it away, people will take it. It's just the way humans are. They don't always know that there's a bunch of stuff that would mean a lot to you if you could get it
Right.
done.
Yeah, I'm gonna slug that the caregiver's paradox,
Yeah, good
right?
one.
And so not caregiver as in you and I caring for older parents or kids necessarily, but relationships, other people, and just our own happiness needs to be nurtured, right? We need to give care to those things.
Uh-huh.
But as you explained it, there's a paradox here because you can go too far to either extreme, right? You can be one of those people who has no life
Yeah.
and is constantly giving to other people. And you are, in a sense, removing joy from your own world and self because you're spending so much time trying to preserve and care for other people that you never get your creative stuff done. You
Yeah.
never express it. And then the furthest other side of that is where you really don't care about other people because what you're doing is the thing that is the most important thing in the world, right?
Yeah.
And I know of stories personally in my life, I won't get into them, where one person was like, "No, my creative world life is the only thing that exists for me."
Yeah.
You're part of it, but you're on the edge kind of thing.
I
And
gotta
and
throw Cher out there as I'm throwing Cher under the bus. I
oh,
think,
you're throwing down the share card.
yeah, I think Cher said that a long time ago. She's like, have him washed and brought to my tent because I don't, I'm in charge here, and I've got my career, and I'm doing, I'm bringing home the bacon, but I don't need anybody else to tell me what to do, especially probably after Sonny died, although they were divorced before that. But
Yeah.
anyway, sorry to interrupt. Go
Well,
on.
she seemed to be very broken up by the passing of Sonny Bono, which I think deserves to be mentioned for the sharing
She
out
was. You know
there.
what she said at the funeral?
No, I don't.
This is the worst thing that's ever happened to me. And I was like, I think it happened to Sonny.
Yeah, I've seen that happen as well. So and so's diagnosed with cancer. Oh my God, this is the worst thing that's ever happened to me, a healthy, thriving person.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, so if there's this continuum, right? And one extreme is where you're so giving of yourself that you never get to your creative life and you
Yeah.
never get to live it. And then the other is where you're so committed to yourself that, nobody else is able to get in.
Yeah. And I would like to just pop in and say that there's no judgment from my perspective. I can definitely I admire Cher, okay? But there's no judgment to me. If somebody wants to make the choice to prioritize their creative art, their art,
Hmm.
um, over the relationships in their lives, that's their choice. It doesn't affect me. And the same as if somebody chooses to sort of backseat their art to the point where that they just never get to it. maybe that's not, maybe that's less of a choice. It
Mhm.
can be because we have conditioning and expectations and, just need. Like we are both sandwich generation and we know that there's got to be somebody there for people.
Yeah.
But I do think I don't judge either end. What I think is that you've got to find what's right for you. And I'm discovering that what's right for me is not what was right for me 5 years ago or 10 years ago when my kids were younger, um, or 15 years ago or 20 years ago. What's right for me now is to, you know, spend money I don't necessarily, that I could put to something more useful in air quotes
Mhm.
s- on something that I want to do creatively because I'm like, it's important to me and I don't want to disappoint myself. I don't want
Right.
to let myself down in going yet another time. Oh, you know what? I better pay for the dentist first. I better, of course, I'm
Mhm.
going to pay for the dentist first, actually. But, other than that, there's things that I can do without in order to do with something
Mhm.
that feeds your project. And so I just think that's something that we can talk about, like how do you see it?
Right. Well, interesting that you bring up the dentist because I've never addressed my polydactylism. My sixth fingers are still there. My
Yeah.
tennis swing is way off the charts
I
because
mean,
of
what are you saying? You'd make a good dentist? It's a little late.
well, you can't get that many fingers anywhere,
That
right?
extra finger, I'm saying it could hold the instrument or something. Well, I'd rather,
That's true.
yeah,
That's true.
anyway,
It's an
anyway.
extra, string that you can hit. No, I mean, so when I think about life in the, generally, I didn't want to be a bad parent,
Yeah.
right? So I wanted to make sure I took care of my kids and did the best for them that I could. So I would judge a little bit, right? I
Mm,
think there are,
yeah.
I don't think it's good to be on either extreme. And
Okay,
I
that
think,
makes sense. I agree with that for
yeah,
sure.
I think if you give up on yourself, then you're letting yourself down. You have chosen who can I let down? Well, me, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And over and over and over, and you get acclimatized to that, and that becomes your default, which I
Yeah.
think is a bad pattern. I think that's a really negative pattern. And the same thing for the flip side, where anybody who comes to you with a need is going to get a no,
Yeah.
because it's getting in my way of me,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I think then, you're probably, if you have kids, you're being a bad parent, you're being a bad spouse, you're being a bad friend, all those kinds of things. And so you're letting down everybody. And
Yeah,
I
that
think
makes sense. You've turned me
the,
around completely.
yeah, well, and so I think the nature of the question then is who can you disappoint and how much? And I think you just gave a great answer, which is, the context really matters, right? So
Context.
in terms of the kid question, because that's the big one, right?
Yeah.
That's the huge one. In terms of the kid question is as they get older, they need to be more independent,
Yeah.
right? And so it's better you're a better parent by saying no.
Hmm.
In a lot of circumstances, not all, but in a
Yeah.
lot of circumstances, than you are to say yes,
Yeah.
right?
And by
And
by no and yes, you mean to what? Helping them with stuff or
yeah, if they, I need your time, I need money,
yeah.
right? And sort of giving them to say, no, this is a growing moment where you need to learn and
Yeah.
figure these things out, which I think is good. Even though I think both of us like to be generous parents.
Hmm.
But there you were saying in that context, because they're old enough to manage and
Yeah.
navigate, that I it I can disappoint them, right?
Yeah.
Because we've also both had, especially when kids are teenagers, where you
Yeah.
say no and they flip out because, they're just, at that stage, right?
Mm.
So that's, in that circumstance, you can disappoint the kid,
Yeah,
right?
it builds strength in them to say no to doing for them things that they can do for themselves. I think you're absolutely right. Yeah. You
Yeah.
want you want to build their own capacity sometimes by saying no.
Right. And then the flip side of that is, your 9 or 10-year-old has the big dance recital and they need, like $300 for the costume and $200 for to travel or something like that, and you say, well, I'm going to have to put a little extra work in to be able to make that happen, so I'm not going to do it. So I'm going to disappoint that child and
Mm,
say, you can't do that.
yeah.
To me, that's wrong, right? That's where you've got to suck it up and make that happen
I
for them.
see. Yeah.
And other people would have a different, they might say, oh no, I think you're kind of spoiling the kid. But the point being is that if you're going to disappoint somebody else or yourself, think about the context, and probably ramifications for that person, that kind of thing. But
Yeah, it's contextual
you
completely.
know, and I got to say, in my life, and we've talked about this in a previous segment where we said there's only so many burners on the stove
Yeah.
that you can have on at a time. And the one that I've pretty much turned down to very low simmer is the friend one,
Yeah,
right?
right. Yeah.
And, I wouldn't have enough time to do the work that I want to do, which means living the life that I want to live.
Yeah.
If I had a huge social network of friends and I was constantly having to do things to make those people happy.
Hmm.
So, for me, that's where I've chosen, okay, I can, perhaps let those people down, or I can let that part of my life down.
Hmm.
So,
That makes sense. Yeah, I think COVID really helped with that for lots of people. I had been honestly probably 3 or 4 days a week going out, not always at night, but going out to support and encourage and, be around my friends. I love my friends, but um, COVID, everybody went, "Mm, no, sorry," and which was great. I mean, I did too. I didn't want to go out, and then I realized how much time I gained back. It was
mm,
incredible, and what time gives me is bandwidth. It's like it
mhm,
gives me it gives me plenty in a way that nothing else can. An extra several thousand in the bank. Money comes and goes. It's whatever it is.
mhm,
But time can make a whole day completely different. It's
mhm,
like you can build in an experience, and I do think maybe I agree with you that the extreme of each, the extreme ends of I never do anything for anybody except myself, so I disappoint everybody basically except myself, or I disappoint nobody except myself. Those are not areas I want to inhabit, or would I recommend them to anybody else, as a place you want to live. But the sometimes you can have a richer life by being a little more discerning about where you spend your time and energy, and so
mm,
can your friends, because the things you used to do together, they're boring now, or they're no fun. And so they would take, let's say, I've never been a mall person, but let's say you would go to the mall with your friends for 4 hours every month or something, and just walk around, look at clothes, maybe buy an
uh,
ice cream or whatever. Then you go, okay, well, I actually need that time, and I need that time of day to do something else. But then you just meet your friend later for coffee, and that's just as good. Or you go for a walk, a quicker walk, or it doesn't have to be an all or nothing
so
thing.
yeah, you're saying set boundaries.
I guess I am. Is that what they're called? I've never really
Yeah,
understood
believe
boundaries.
it or not.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I just think, yeah, because it's context. It's all contextual, and it can take a really long time to figure out that something you're doing doesn't need to happen that way.
Yeah. So, and that requires, I think, a lot more thought and intentionality than just having a default position.
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
yeah,
Where, it's not like I'm gonna turn this burner down to a bare simmer.
uh-huh,
It's more I'm gonna, really decide what does that burner do to sustain me, to feed me,
yeah,
and how can I set limits and, and actually be able to continue to use that burner,
yeah.
but in a
When
way
can when do I need to switch it off? When do I need to just change the pan, Like, because every pan is a container, so, or pot, or whatever you want to call it. So you
right.
can you can have you can have multiple pots on one burner as long as you're not trying to cook everything all at the same time on that same burner, you know? So it's like, yeah, you can probably find ways to. I noticed that I got a little cabin fevery when I started working and living in the same place. And
Mhm.
I'm gradually getting used to the idea that I need to build in more outside time with my friends and or without my friends, you know, but I like my friends. So that once I know that about myself, it's a lot easier for me to make the pot fit the burner.
Boy, that's a great insight. Yeah, the pot should fit the burner. And I'm the same. So two things is one, I'm kind of the same about that where because I work where I live,
Yeah,
I get really cabin fevery as well, or just like I have an energy that I need to dissipate, right?
same here. Yeah.
So as people are probably sick of hearing, I like to run, right? Because it
Yeah.
dissipates energy. But I've been finding as of late that no, I'm actually requiring more interaction.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I'm seeking out more sort of shared group experience type things
Yeah.
as opposed to more loner kind of thing. And then it was interesting when you're talking about um, COVID,
Mm,
and I had the same experience, right? Where I
mm.
was like, all of a sudden I'm freed of so many responsibilities
Yeah.
that I did find that I had more time and more capacity. And because you're not going out as much and those sorts of things, you have a little bit more, you're not spending as much money.
True. Yeah.
And I find that there's the flip side of that coin, which is creatives who are performers
Yeah.
absolutely going insane during COVID,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
so I like to listen to the Judge John Hodgman podcast. And John Hodgman performs outside of that. Jesse Thorne, who's his partner on that, performs outside of that. And so during COVID, they couldn't go anywhere and they couldn't perform. And it drove them absolutely nuts.
Mm.
But I think it also impacted their capacity. Well, maybe it impacted their capacity, but it definitely impacted them, I think, financially and emotionally. But
Mm.
financially because they couldn't get out and do the performing that they needed to do. And I think of musicians, you can't get out and perform, so you
Yeah.
can't get paid for gigs. It and I wonder too, if you're thinking about other domains of creativity, does this I don't know if it's the question that changes or the answer that would change, right?
Hmm.
So,
Who can you disappoint being the question? So what might it change to?
well, I'm thinking about so if you're a musician, right, and you're a gigging musician,
Yeah.
because I think there's real opportunities to put music out, but then go and play live, and that's how you sustain yourself. But that means travel, and that means
Hmm.
being on the road, and that means being away from home. And so if you have a wife and kids, that's they're gonna have to be okay with that.
Yeah. Or
And
gigging locally. Like I just think so I think that the question is so broad that it's valid for any creative pursuit. In
Mhm,
fact, I would say it's valid for anybody's life, period. Um, that you can ask yourself, who can I disappoint? And as long as you put yourself into that imaginary sea of people that you're looking at,
mhm.
um, maybe we should flip the question on its head and say, who can't I disappoint? And what does disappointment look like in this context, you know? I know it's
Yeah.
a little more complicated that way, but I think it's more realistic. There's certain people you cannot disappoint, but what does disappointment look like for them? Given that you can't read their minds and you often don't have
Mhm.
conversations about, I mean, I've never had a conversation where I asked somebody, you know, how can I not disappoint you? Or what could I do that would disappoint you? Like how do you
Mhm.
view me and our relationship in such, it's just too deep. I'm sorry, I'm Canadian. We don't really talk to each other like that.
I'm a New Englander. We don't either. We're bridging the divide. Yeah, we wouldn't even have a podcast.
Yeah. Fuck. I mean, I think we're disappointing John Irving right now, and I'm absolutely fine with
Yeah, I think he's just completely going nuts. Like
it.
there's so many sharings of feelings. It's ah. But yeah, so if you're going to be a musician who's gigging, if you're going to be an actor, right? Because unless you live in New York City, which has everything that you need right there,
Or
uh,
LA.
in terms of, if you're a theater type act,
Right, right, yeah.
you're going to be, but still you're going to be working nights, you're going to be pulling long hours. I mean, is there this benefit, if you're a young creative listening to this who's not yet married and just beginning a relationship, do you need to have that conversation where you have to say, look, I am this type of creative, which means you're going to have to sacrifice this?
Interesting. Interesting. Oh, wow. Okay, so I'm looking at my marital history. Yeah, just the one. James, just the one.
That's the one.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, so in terms of loyalty, I was at the mechanic recently, and they said you need to come back next week. How do we know you're going to come back, right? And
Yeah.
I have just switched mechanics because my other mechanics he lost his place. He's no longer in business.
Mm,
And I looked at them and I said, since I moved to Exeter in 1999,
mm.
I have had three marriages and one mechanic. You figure it out. I'll
Yeah,
be back, you know.
yeah. And they let you walk away.
And they
Okay,
let me walk away. That was enough.
that's so funny. I mean, okay, so where
So you've got this marriage
oh yeah, you were
that
saying
you were about to brag on.
it what no, I wasn't. Are you kidding? You've heard my story, but you were saying that, if you're a young creative person and you don't yet have a partner, it doesn't have to be marriage or offspring, you kind of you should consider, or maybe you owe it to your potential partner to have the conversation about this stuff is important to me. And I'm just thinking about when I got together with my husband, um, I was so obviously into writing and I took it so seriously. I got up at 5 to write for 2 hours before work and stuff like that. And I had a heavy job, long hours. So I would almost feel like it would be redundant for me to say I'm into this and it's going to cost me a lot of time and energy and it's going to impact you because I actually feel like I picked my two initial long-term, all three, including my husband. So a chef, a taxi driver that worked nights, and my husband was a bartender when I met him.
Hmm.
I picked those people because they were gone. They slept in the daytime. They were gone at dinner time because they worked those hours, either driving the cab or in the restaurant slash bar. And I would have the house to myself from the minute I got home from work till when they came home at 2:30 in the morning
Wow.
or 4 in the morning. And I'm not saying I went, "Oh my God, this is perfect. I've thought this through."
Mhm.
I'm just saying I didn't connect with people who were around all the time because I didn't want to. I wanted to have my own space in the context of a relationship, basically.
Right. And so, well, here's a question, and feel free to say no answer. But do you feel like your creative life impinged on your marriage?
Huh. Maybe when I borrowed a bunch of money to do an MFA.
So, but your marriage that was early on, I
Yeah,
mean,
that was like, I don't know, 15 years ago. Let me think about that. Did my creative life impinge on it? I don't think it did. I mean, that's just me talking though. That's like asking a fish, you
yeah,
know, how's that water? I don't know because I'd have to ask Richard really because I think it was so clear that I was just this person. This is how I operate. And he had his own shit that he was into. Like it wasn't, we had very little in common, in fact, but it was, he was a reader, and which we did have in common. And he had his own stuff that he was into, and he didn't want to be in each other's pockets all the time either. And so I like independent people who don't need to do everything together.
yeah, and
That's
just
just my style.
make sure because we have a little bit of a mixed idiom here. When you say in pockets, you don't mean money from each other. You mean, you know, tied to the hip.
Yes, yes, yes. We don't need to do it. Like we'd go to parties together. Probably, well, Richard certainly. And we would split. We would go and just talk to
Uh,
different people. That was just started. We didn't ever talk about that's what we're going to do. We just kind of did that because we just gravitated. We both like parties. And so anyway, I feel like we're getting a little off track, but the point, and that's my fault completely, but the point is that that idea of telling somebody that your creative work is going to be a factor is such a great idea, and yet it never occurred to me because I felt like it was as plain as the nose on my face.
right.
So I wonder, did you do it?
Um, Probably. Yeah.
You don't remember?
Well, I'm trying to think of instances, but I think when you choose a creative life, you are choosing a pathway that comes with a lot of uncertainty. And
Yes.
especially if it includes this sort of entrepreneurship of having, I want to be the writer, artist, what have you, but I'm also going to earn money off this creative thing that I
Yeah.
do.
Yeah.
Um, just the mere fact that you are choosing that life uncompromisingly, which I
Hmm.
certainly did. That pathway comes with a lot of uncertainty, a lot of ups and downs, a lot of stress, a lot of stuff.
Yeah, you're right. And it
So,
can lean very heavily on the partner who has a jobby job because then there's, if you have kids, there's this thing I know that Rich went through. It was like, well, I can't, I worked here for a long time. He worked at certain locations with his job, and he's like, I would have left by now, but I've got dental, and I've got, because we all have medical coverage up here, but
mm,
the dental's, kind of a big deal when you got little kids, especially if they need braces and stuff. So, it didn't stop him in the end, but it did delay him doing what he would have wanted to do had he not been attached to somebody with zero job security, zero pension, zero this, zero that. Just every time, the only time I made money was when I was working. And so, yeah, so I would maybe that part of the conversation I think is not obvious to people who aren't obsessed with a creative thing. And it sometimes isn't even obvious to people who are obsessed with the creative thing themselves.
mhm.
Like I went into it going, this is what I'm doing. And if you have a problem with that, there's lots of other fish in the sea, but
Go pound sand, buddy.
love you, but that's a non-negotiable. But we never really had that conversation. The conversation I was incapable of having because I didn't know this was going to be a thing was that this will come with a lifelong level of basically fluctuating and uncertain income.
Mhm.
Sometimes it'll be high, sometimes it'll be low, and it won't be tied to effort because sometimes effort gets made and then 2 years later,
Right,
the
right.
payoff happens, right? Which doesn't happen in jobby jobs. So,
Yeah.
yeah, so that would have been handy to have that conversation.
Yeah, and that was a tough, tricky wicket in my first marriage because I
Mm,
got my first big opportunity, which was a book contract with MIT,
right.
and it didn't pay a ton, but it took a lot of time.
Yeah.
And payoff for that was not immediate. It was more, this is a long-term planning opportunity, or more long-term opportunity. And by long-term, I mean like a year, and then you
Yeah. Yeah.
more opportunity. But um, yeah, that was a tough conversation.
Yeah.
Uh, and from my perspective, it would have been really wrong to say no to that opportunity
Yeah,
because
for sure.
it would have been limiting, everything that she wanted. That would have made even harder because, here's the way to get to where we wanted to go.
Yeah.
But it was hard to, explain that and reconcile it and, have it be understood and internalized and supported in the way that, as me, I would have hoped. And I think she had a trouble with it too in a very legitimate way. I don't, I don't mean to paint there's a bad guy or good guy in this one.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
you- but there's also when we're having this conversation too, that makes a big assumption, which is that our creative impulse and work is not a hobby, right? It's
Yeah.
not like somebody who golfs and says, I want to be a subpar golfer, so I'm going to sacrifice this, and this to do that. This is more substantive than that, you know.
Okay. Well, let me think about that one. Um, I think the actual difference, because I think the actual difference might be there's something to do with time, like the length of time that it can take for creative work to sort of pay out, if you will, and the fact that it's always this apprenticeship situation, no matter what level you're at. We're just talking specifically to and for mid-level creatives, but if you're every time you increase your skill and get better or get better ideas or a higher concept thing that you're working on next, that doesn't reduce the amount of time that'll take to pan out. It's possible that the payday will be bigger, but it's also possible that it'll land like a lead balloon and there will be no
Yeah.
payday every time. So that golf does not have that potential. There is no product in golf. It's strictly how you spend time. And do I think, well, some guy, or some person, I guess, could spend 4 hours in the golf course, or they could spend 4 hours watching TV. Either way, I don't care.
Mhm.
Preferably the golf course, but golf fees cost money. So if I'm that person's partner and we're broke, well, is it a problem? That it's very individual. So I think partly it's it's the fact
Well,
that they're qualitatively different. They're
yeah. So let me another hypothetical.
okay.
So it's the difference between someone who likes to go out and paint on the weekend
Yeah.
and somebody who says, no, this is my life, right?
Okay, I see. Okay. So,
And
okay. I wonder, yeah,
golf
there's
better, golf bad, you know.
yeah. No, no, it was fine. It was actually it was made me be able to see the difference in a way that the second analogy I don't think I would have seen. Um, So I guess with the second example, going out to paint on the weekend, I still feel like there's something coming out of it. And whether the person chooses not to do anything with what they paint is separate from whether what they're doing is a hobby.
Yeah. Well, all right. So let me refine it a little bit further, right? So personally, if, my partner came to me and said, "You know what? I am really sick of this work a day thing that I'm doing."
Yeah.
Right? I want to commit myself to this creative pursuit.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
so to do that, I'm going to develop a plan. I'm going to start to move in that direction,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So that's how supportive would I feel of that? And I think pretty supportive,
Mm.
right? Whereas if somebody says, no, I like my job, I like what I do, but I need you to make compromises and sacrifices because I decided I want to go do this creative thing, but it's not really something it's not going to be my life. It's just, I want to go do it.
Hmm.
And I think it's that level of commitment, whereas that, if somebody is just sort of, I'm goofing around or experimenting, and that's all good and it's all growth, and, I don't mean to demean it. But if they're saying to me, I'm going to impinge on you to be able to do that, I'm less willing to say yes
Hmm.
than somebody who comes with I think, which is a much bigger, and I don't want to frame it as an ask, but a much bigger, um, uh, I guess it is an ask where it's like I need to change my life and I want it to be a creative life. And
Yeah.
it feels like, yeah, okay, let's figure it out.
It's really interesting because I think there are examples in of definitely of writing couples, and I'm trying to think specifically of who, where they said, you know what, we'll take turns. I'll write for a year and you support us.
Yeah.
And then you write and I'll support us for the same length of time. And I wish I could remember who I was reading about that did that. And what happened was that one of them was successful and the other one wasn't, and it turned into one of them just wrote all the time, and I think ended up being successful enough that the other person didn't have to work. But I think it was the female partner was successful enough um, that her male partner
Oh,
just
yeah, that's Carson McCullers.
is it?
Yeah. So, well, there's a couple of different of those stories, and the more contemporary writer, I can't remember his name. So we're both having the same brain fart. But Carson McCullers and her husband, they both wanted to be writers. The husband, for whatever reason, I believe I'm getting this right, had a better job already. So they just said, why don't you, he said, why don't you go first?
Yeah,
And then he wrote Lonely is the
The Heart of
Heart
the Lonely Hunter.
Hunter
Yeah,
and blows up,
yeah.
right? And I think their marriage, didn't work out. And then the same for this other writer. Boy, I wish I could remember his name because he's a really big name. But he was married to a woman. They were both writers, and they sacrificed everything. Where they
Mm,
went out once a year for dinner on their
Jesus.
their anniversary.
Yeah.
And he blew up and became big, and she didn't, and the marriage, didn't survive.
Yeah. Okay. So there are to return to your sort of question or thought experiment of if it's just a hobby, if the person has no intention of making it a paying concern, um, is it less valid than if the person genuinely wants to make it a paying concern? I think we might
Mhm.
have different points of view on this. My point of view is a hobby is fine. I don't care what your hobby is, as long as you pull your weight. And if you need a gap in time before you can pull your weight, say for the second scenario where the person is like, no, I'm going to make this a living, but I need time to apprentice or train or do whatever I need to do. I want to see your plan, and I want you to save up some money, and I want us to have a plan together because um, I think that's what I failed to do with Rich and I always worked, it's not just like I never didn't have a job. Even if I was
Yeah.
just mostly looking after the kids, I worked part-time and stuff like that. But my goal was always to make a living, and I do creative adjacent work with the editing and the teaching and all that stuff, and I've yet to make a living
Mhm.
anywhere close to a living with writing, but I kind of gave up, thinking I would make a living at writing on day one. I was like, no, I have way too much to learn. This is a long game. This is not going to be I will stress the fuck out of myself if I think I'm going to sell enough shitty novels to make
Mhm.
a, to make a living in the first 10 years. So I had to do other stuff, and I think that's maybe the difference. It never crossed my mind. Oh, it did cross my mind to go go work in a store or something. I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah. Well,
But
yeah, I
I just
mean,
never did it because I was making more money. I was making money anyway.
yeah. Well, my joke with people is I'm a writer, so I'm really good at working in a restaurant, you know.
Yeah, yeah,
So, there's definitely that piece to it. But I think, I'm coming to this recognition that there's just a hard reality that if you want to pursue this life, you're going to disappoint somebody. You
yeah,
have to disappoint somebody. And it's not you have to do it like you have to target somebody and say, that's the person I have to disappoint. But it's just part of this process.
yeah, yeah.
That-
I can give you an example from my life. When I was doing my MFA, I was writing for my thesis, I was writing a novel, and the girls were 4 and 8 years old. And not every weekend, but many weekends, they'd go to a movie with Rich in the movie theater, just because he likes movies, and they were all kid
Mhm.
animated movies. And I was a hard no on all of them because I needed to write. And
Mhm.
I'm sure I disappointed my kids by not going to the movie with them. I won't say all of them, probably once every 5 or 6 times I went to the movie.
Mhm.
And I love movies too, but I just had to decide, what was more important. And I figured they were okay because I read to them every night. I did all, I was a mom
Mhm.
for sure, but I didn't spend 4 or 5 hours on a Saturday doing something that they didn't
Mhm.
need me to be there for, that was already a treat for them without me there, maybe even more of a treat. So it's that
Mhm.
kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah. For me, thinking about as a parent, there were definite trade-offs, right?
Yeah,
Because single parent a lot.
for sure.
And
Yeah.
so doing this work actually made it possible for me to be with the kids in the morning, getting them off to school, supporting them, and
Yeah.
then at the end of the day, going and picking them up,
Yeah.
helping homework, all that, really be a much more engaged parent. But there were trade-offs too,
Yeah.
because there were times where it's like, no, I have to do this, and we can't go to the playground, we can't do this. You've got to, you know, be cool about this.
Yeah.
And but I just sort of feel like there's this reality that unless quickly write that novel or get that part or write that song or what have you,
Yeah.
there's going to be a period of where you're not going to necessarily be as present or as available or what have you to somebody.
Yeah. I
It's
agree.
just
Yeah.
you're not going to have it. And yeah, you think about when you see, something about somebody goes on about, I love my big family. We get together every Sunday and it's lots of cooking and da 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 da.
Mhm.
And I think, oh man, I just don't have the time to be that
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and then maybe that's their way of being creative. It's like I just think there's certain people are just born knowing that their life won't be full enough unless they do this thing that they're
Mhm.
interested in doing. And then there's people who are born finding life plentiful the way it is, and they don't need to do something extra. And I think if you're one of the people who need to do that thing in order to feel like the world is an okay place to live,
Mhm.
then the person you cannot disappoint is yourself. And I say that as somebody who disappointed myself plenty of times by not
Yeah.
being able to follow through on a project because I was overcommitted to,
Mhm.
raising a family and doing all that stuff. But I think, standing where I'm standing now, it's like I- I'm in a privileged position because my kids are older and um, I wouldn't say I'm financially secure, but I'm independent, and so I can make decisions to do stuff that if I didn't do it would disappoint me, however idiosyncratic they are. It's like any statement of belief in yourself around your creative stuff. I think it's really important to, as soon as you realize that if you don't do that, you'll disappoint yourself, it's really, really important to figure out how you can do it. Um,
Mhm.
yeah, and that sounds really selfish, I know, but it's like
No.
you are who you are. You got to live the life you've been given.
Mhm. All right, so we've been going on. We're out of time here, but
Okay.
we have the question of who can you disappoint, and it's not a specific person,
Yeah.
but I think it's under having a set of criteria.
Yeah.
So, how would you sort of sum that up?
Whew. I would say, multiple burner use, like figure out whether what you think is disappointing somebody is actually disappointing. There are many creative ways to be friends with people and
Mhm.
to help people and to do all the things that you are feel that are expected of you. And also you bring way more to the world if you are paying attention to the quality of your own life too.
Mhm.
So that wasn't really a criteria. What do you think?
No, I think I like what you said because it's this flexibility to set boundaries but continue to be engaged with people,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And so, the person says, "Oh, I want you to be all weekend doing this," and they're always, sort of making a big demand or something like, or I need to have hours long phone calls. It's like, yeah, I want to connect with you, but here's how I can do it.
yeah.
And so it's keeping the burner a little bit higher, but setting boundaries that work.
Hmm.
And knowing, I think there's just going to be the times where you're just like, no. You know, I for the next 6 months, I am finishing this project because I got to get this thing done.
Yeah, and
And
maybe seasonal availability is actually a good idea. Like what if you're just ready, you can go for a beer in the summer, but you don't go for them in the winter because you're busy and it's dark early and you don't want to, or whatever, but yeah, I think it's good to, I wonder if it's possible to be deliberate about it.
Yeah, I think it's hard to be, well, maybe, I don't know. I always think from a writer's perspective, and so we have a lot of latitude about when we do things. Whereas if you're more performance and that kind of
Hmm.
thing,
Yeah,
you don't necessarily have that latitude.
that's true.
So I could see saying to people, look, from September 1 to December 1, every single year, that is my book rating period.
Yeah,
End of sentence.
yeah,
Outside of that time, we can negotiate.
yeah,
But, I think as a writer, you can do that. I think it's harder in other creative pursuits, but
I would imagine.
but
Yeah.
I think you can try and have some intentionality about it, you know.
Yeah, and even just try on that hat as a thought experiment and never forget to bring in context. Does this person need you as much as you think they do?
Mhm.
Or are they fine?
Mhm.
And
Yeah,
and also the whole idea of disappointing is kind of predicated on the idea that you know what somebody wants. And disappointment in itself is a judgment in some
mhm.
ways. So if I'm disappointed in you, that means you didn't do what I wanted you to do. And you know what? I got to suck it up because what I want you to do and what you were put on the earth to do might be two different things.
Right, right. All right. Da-dun-da. Thanks for listening to Gifted Underachievers, the podcast for mid-level creatives with delusional ambitions. We'd love to hear how we're doing, so please leave a comment, join our chat page, or send us an email at giftedunderachievers@substack.com. You can find us where you like to listen to your podcasts, Spotify, iTunes, and so on. And please hit the share and or subscribe button. It really does help a lot. Hope you've enjoyed this segment, and have an awesome day.